What I'd like to do in the kind of very brief slot is to just sketch out some perspectives really on some of today's challenges and developments and how they might impact protection practice in engaging with national authorities. I want to focus on three areas. I want to very quickly talk about context. I want to talk about the language that we use based on my experience. And I want to talk about timing. I want to draw on my experience. It's not just with ProCap, but also having worked on being a human rights and protection advisor in some of the mediation processes that I've worked in. Very quickly, context. I think a traditional perspective has always been that national authorities, we're looking at the national level, ministries, and we've had a very interesting sort of outline of different stakeholders. We're looking at the local authorities, which again is a complex group of elders, community groups, etc., and also the administrative element. I'm leaving the military aside for now, but the lines are very fluid. And with the new forms of violence and conflict that have emerged, and you've also got a much more intractability in conflicts and new definitions of conflicts that have emerged, we also have to look at how we're working in the context we're working in terms of often we're working in the context of the implementation of some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire agreement. And so it's not just the changing nature of conflict, it's also the changing nature of peace. And I think that's quite important because implementation of these agreements is increasingly decentralized. That means it creates greater challenges for us as protection actors and protection advocates. And also the implementation of these agreements relies much more heavily on social structures and on non-state actors, which is Tarek's area, and no longer exclusively, I think, on governments and formal militaries. And this very much affects how we navigate protection outcomes. We're also dealing with the changing nature and the role of the state, how states and the respect that states have. And there's a particular example, for example, when I was working in Somalia, and I was working as a protection advisor on one of the many attempts, many of the negotiations that were going on at the time. And what was quite interesting there, in Somalia, when preparatory discussions were underway, the question that was not asked was, what do Somalis want? It was very much decreed by the governments actually sponsoring the various processes that Somalia needs to have a state or the construction of a state model, which immediately influenced who people went to in order to advocate for particular protection outcomes. Rather than ignoring and rather ignored the fact that the Somali system of clanship and regional control and government was not in line with the Western model of a state, I suppose. And also the oral traditions of storytelling, the role of the elders, the clan elders, was not taken into account. And I just want to sort of emphasize very much that I think it needs to be constantly recalibrated and navigated about how we engage and look at actors that are not necessarily part of the formal processes and the formal people who are presented to us. Second point on the use of language. If you want to understand grievances, for example, when in my work in Central African Republic or in Mali, many of my colleagues observed there's a new form of language that has entered the conversation when they're trying to discuss. And I've also experienced that. There's kind of a uniqueness in the new conflicts, and that we're now in constant sort of talking about sacred worldviews. And also conflicts are about something very local. So if you want to effect a reduction in violence, a reduction in sexual violence, for example, I think it's very important to engage with groups not as if they're a uniform group, but also really understanding that they're often deeply fragmented. Jihadists in Mali and the Sahel are not one group. And this would also highlight to me again the importance of a sort of anthropological and cultural literacy for protection practitioners. My takeaway from this was that the representation of the parties, as I've already said, has changed enormously, and they come from less homogenous social groups. And that's why you actually need greater skills, given the new types of conflicts. It's not, I think working on protection now, and particularly protection advocacy, is about more things than it used to be. And there's a demand for much greater elasticity. We also, I think, have to pay more attention to small moments, to the use of language, to the use of interpreters. The likelihood of getting things wrong because of how you're communicating something often gets completely misinterpreted, which happened to me frequently now as trying to put together protection outcomes around sexual violence and engaging the various both national and local authorities in trying to find a way of addressing that. Another aspect that I think is really critical on language is to fine-tune language and terminology and almost develop a bespoke glossary. And I think that's in parallel to advocating for protection outcomes. There's often a general presumption that commonly used international terminology means the same to all participants. But for example, in negotiations in the Colombian peace process, the parties had a very different understanding of the term civil society. And when we unpacked it, the question was posed, what do you call those people who are not politically affiliated but want to have a voice? And in fact, they came up with a notion of invested independent actors. So again, I just want to kind of a word of caution. Be careful how you define the groups you're dealing with. Not everybody has the same understanding or identifies with them in the same way. Final point is very much about timing. I think there's often a sense that people aren't always ready to engage in specific issues. It happened to me in the Central African Republic when, for example, I went and saw the Prime Minister and members of the cabinet with the head of the UN mission to talk about the investigations and allegations into sexual exploitation and abuse. And we had a very learned discussion. He used, but it was a she actually at the time, and other cabinet members used all the right language. And we came to a particular agreement. At the same time, colleagues from the protection cluster and also from the protection of civilians unit in the UN mission there were talking to religious leaders and came up with completely different outcomes. Unfortunately, it has to be said, and I'm saying that against myself and those of us involved, we didn't compare notes soon enough, which actually slowed down the process enormously. This is obviously about coordination, but it's also that I think we need to be very careful whether the situation is ripe, if you like. And people aren't always interested in discussing the issues. They're just going along with what is presented to them because they feel they have to. And I really have learned, I think, over the years that engaging and advocating for protection outcomes, it's not always conclusive. It's about actually holding the door open to create a space where you can have further discussions, where you can actually create an environment where there's a connectedness and potentially a form of trust is built. Another example is when I worked in Haiti after the earthquake, and I was asked to accompany I was on a mission with various ambassadors and the head of the UN mission to go and visit the president. And he was completely traumatized. And he was sitting in the palace, which is partly fallen down. And everybody bombarded him with how this had to happen and that had to happen. And donors were going to come and do this. And protection of women and children is really important. He nodded, but he was completely traumatized. And I feel very strongly here what matters again as advocates on protection. And again, it's taking a step back, is to be human, to be practical, to follow the movement of what is going on, and establishing real relationships is ultimately one of the most important aspects and is actually crucial to building trust. Also, as a protection advisor, I think we need to know who we are, why we're there, and also be clear whose agents we are and what assumptions people are making about us before we use language that we think should be so familiar to everybody else.
And let me start with one thing about the whole approach and with the literature which we are using in order to engage mainly with the non-state groups. Thinking about negotiation, all of us to remember that the negotiation theory, which we are sometimes using to engage with non-state groups, actually were developed for a more rational engagement rather than what I would call later non-rational people to engage with. If we look today globally, we have around, at least the ones being mapped by ICRC, around 640 non-state groups which are operating globally. And these people are in control of around 60 to 80 million people around the world. And that shows when we are going to engage how much really we have to do work around understanding their interest and understanding mainly when we are talking about protection, what is the motivation, but also what are the challenges and the opportunities to engage on that specific part. For example, when I was working in Syria, I mean, I was covering Homs area, which is a small government, not a small government, it's a government with around 2 million people. But in 2012, the non-state groups were around 45 groups, which we are operating around us. And our ability to find a common ground to engage with them around mainly some concept, and the most sensitive concept, I have to say, not only with engaging with the non-state groups, even when now engaging with the state groups is becoming protection, because as there is a fragmentation on the other side, which is the non-state groups, there is also a lot of fragmentation in our side, whereby protection is not being seen anymore. The incentive is being always seen the constraints, and a lot on the humanitarian side would like to say, when we are engaged with a non-state group, please don't start with the protection. Please don't bring protection to the table, because that will be very provocative for our interlocutors. And I fully understand this. I'm coming from some of the region where I understand some of the sensitivity. But also, we should not forget that the engagement mainly with the non-state group always started on a transactional basis, meaning it's not anymore about doing the business with the state groups, with the states, or with other things. And it's always starts with most of these interlocutors actually went through some protection concepts. Right. So the trust is not there, the language is not there, the doubt is there. What is normative for us does not resonate to them. Right. And when you put all these things together, also you need to remember we are not dealing with, we are dealing with most of the people with a morally corrupt people, where what you think is appealing to you and to me is not appealing to them. I remember when Ansar Sharia took Zanzibar in Yemen, and they decided, because 6 kids being accused with theft, they want to cut off their hands, and how the discussion ended, that each hand is going to cost us $1,000, right? And how do you run the negotiation around these kind of things? With the non-state groups, with the fragmentation, with the lack sometimes of chain of commands, with the risks associated with engaging with them around the anti-terrorism laws, the sanctions, the risk which you are taking individually. Also, we should never forget the time, mainly when we are also engaging on a protection negotiation. I mean, I remember when Daesh took over Sadat village in Homs, I was engaging on a kind of a Christian community where they decided to kill them all. And I engaged with them. I mean, we were given 36 hours by the regime. If we are not going to conclude the negotiation with them, the planes were flying on top of us, where they said, if they are going to kill the local community, we are going to kill everyone. As much as I talked about many opportunities, mainly related to protection, there are, many challenges, there are also many opportunities. The level of sharing of information, is not, 16 years ago, we would not be able to compare notes on some of the issues with ICRC or MSF. And I know this is not yet there, but I would say there are a lot of opportunities being established on the resources being devoted now to engage with non-state groups, comparing to time before. Is the structures which we are putting in place in order to make sure these are not individual based, and they are more systematic. So I just want to say, as much as we are seeing a lot of challenges and we are more failing sometimes than succeeding, mainly when it comes to the protection, engaging with them, I would say there is a lot of stories which we are not documenting, very successful stories about how really, when we are approaching the protection in a collective approach, we are doing some successes here or there.